I need to talk to you about something that I know is weighing heavily on your mind right now. It's that constant mental battle happening inside your head every single day. You know exactly what I'm talking about. That moment when someone asks you a simple question in English, and your brain immediately goes into overdrive. First, you hear the English words. Then your mind quickly translates them into your native language. Then you formulate your answer in your native language. And finally, you translate that answer back into English before you can even open your mouth to respond. By the time you've gone through this entire mental marathon, the person asking the question is looking at you with confusion, wondering why you're taking so long to answer something simple. And you feel embarrassed, frustrated, and sometimes even defeated. This mental translation process doesn't just happen during conversations. It happens when you're reading, when you're watching movies, when you're listening to music, even when you're trying to think about what to have for lunch. I want you to understand something very important right now. This is not your fault. This is not a sign that you're not smart enough or that you'll never learn English properly. This mental translation loop is something that literally every single English learner goes through. I have worked with thousands of students from all over the world, from Barcelona to Berlin, from Rome to Paris, from Lisbon to Vienna, and every single one of them has described this exact same experience to me. Let me paint you a picture of what this really feels like on a daily basis. You wake up in the morning, and your brain is naturally thinking in your native language. You think about your plans for the day, what you need to do at work, what you're going to cook for dinner, all in your comfortable, familiar language. Then you get to work or school, and suddenly you need to switch to English mode. It's like trying to drive a car that keeps stalling every few meters. You start a sentence in English, but halfway through, your brain gets confused and wants to use a word from your native language because it feels more natural, more precise. So you pause, you search for the English equivalent, and by the time you find it, you've lost your train of thought. The conversation flows around you while you're still processing, and you feel like you're always one step behind everyone else. This mental switching is absolutely exhausting. It's like having two different radio stations playing in your head at the same time, and you're constantly trying to tune into the right one. Some days you feel like you're making progress, and other days you feel like you're going backwards. One moment you're confident and speaking fluidly, and the next moment you can't remember how to say something as simple as what you did last weekend. What makes this even more frustrating is that you know you understand English well. When you're listening to podcasts like this one, when you're watching movies, when you're reading articles, you comprehend almost everything. The English is going into your brain just fine. It's getting the English back out of your brain in a natural, flowing way that feels impossible. And then there are those moments that really sting. When you're in a group conversation and everyone is talking and laughing, and you have something funny or interesting to contribute, but by the time you've translated your thought into English and found the courage to speak up, the conversation has moved on to something completely different. You end up staying quiet, feeling invisible, feeling like you're on the outside looking in. I know exactly how isolating this feels because I hear about it every single day from students just like you. There's Laura from Florence who told me she feels like she has two different personalities, one in Italian and one in English. And the English version of herself feels like a shadow, unable to express her real thoughts and emotions. There's Andreas from Munich who described feeling like he's wearing a straitjacket whenever he tries to speak English, because his thoughts feel trapped and can't flow naturally. But here's what I need you to understand, and this is crucial. Your brain is not broken. Your brain is actually working exactly as it's supposed to work. When you learned your native language as a child, your brain created incredibly strong, fast pathways for that language. These pathways became automatic, unconscious, effortless. Every thought, every emotion, every reaction flows through these pathways without any effort from you. Now you're asking your brain to create entirely new pathways for English. But instead of being patient with this process, instead of understanding that building new neural pathways takes time, you're expecting your English pathways to be just as fast and automatic as your native language pathways. It's like expecting to run a marathon at the same speed on a brand new trail through the forest as you would on a smooth, familiar track you've been running on your entire life. The mental translation you're doing isn't a failure. It's actually your brain trying to help you by using the pathways it already knows well. Your brain is saying, I know how to process this information really well in your native language, so let me translate it there first, and then we'll figure out the English. Your brain thinks it's being helpful, But what it's actually doing is keeping you stuck in this translation loop. This is why traditional English learning methods often don't solve this problem. You can memorize thousands of vocabulary words. You can study grammar rules until you know them perfectly. You can take conversation classes and practice speaking, but if you don't specifically train your brain to think directly in English, you'll always be stuck in translation mode. Think about learning to ride a bicycle. At first, you had to consciously think about every single movement: balance, pedal, steer, brake. Your brain was working overtime to coordinate all these different actions. But after enough practice, riding a bicycle became automatic. You don't think about balancing anymore, you just balance. You don't think about steering, you just steer. The actions became natural and effortless. Thinking in English works exactly the same way. Right now, thinking in English feels conscious, difficult, and slow, because you're still building those pathways. But with the right kind of practice, thinking in English can become just as automatic and effortless as riding that bicycle. Before we dive deeper into understanding why your brain struggles with this mental translation process, I want to ask you for something that will help both you and thousands of other English learners around the world. If what I've shared so far resonates with you, if you can already feel that spark of hope that natural English thinking is actually possible for you, please take just a moment to hit that subscribe button right now. Your subscription helps us reach more English learners who are facing the same frustrations you've been experiencing. And here's something that would mean the world to me and to our entire English learning community. In the comments below, I want you to share your biggest struggle with thinking in English. Maybe it's that exhausting mental translation process I just described. Maybe it's feeling like you have two different personalities, one confident in your native language and one hesitant in English. Maybe it's that frustrating delay between hearing English and being able to respond naturally. Whatever your specific challenge is, share it with us. Now let's continue with understanding exactly why your brain creates this mental translation loop and what we can do to break free from it. Let me tell you about Thomas, a story that completely changed how I understand this whole thinking process. Thomas grew up in London, born and raised speaking English his entire life. He was one of those people who never had to think about language learning because English was just natural for him. He spoke it perfectly, thought in it effortlessly, and never imagined he would ever struggle with the mental translation problem that so many of my students described to me. When Thomas was 28, he got an incredible job opportunity with a tech company in Berlin. He was excited about the adventure, about living in a new country, about experiencing German culture. He had studied German in university and felt confident about his language skills. He could read German newspapers, understand German movies, and hold basic conversations. He thought the transition would be smooth and natural. But when Thomas arrived in Berlin and started his new job, he discovered something that shocked him. Even though he understood German well and could communicate effectively, his brain was doing exactly the same thing that my English learning students describe. Every time someone spoke to him in German, his mind would automatically translate their words into English first. Then he would formulate his response in English, and finally translate that response back into German before speaking. Thomas told me this was incredibly frustrating because he had never experienced language learning from this perspective before. As a native English speaker, he had always taken for granted how effortless thinking in English felt. He never realized how much mental energy goes into this constant translation process until he was living it himself every single day. The most challenging part for Thomas wasn't work meetings or formal conversations. It was the spontaneous, casual interactions that really highlighted his mental translation problem. When his German colleagues would make jokes during lunch breaks, by the time Thomas had processed the humor through his English-thinking brain and formulated a witty response in German, the moment had passed. Everyone had moved on to the next topic, and Thomas felt like he was always catching up, always one step behind the natural flow of conversation. Thomas lived in Berlin for almost 2 years. And despite using German every day at work and in social situations, he still felt like a translator rather than a natural German speaker. He would lie in bed at night thinking about his day, and all his thoughts and reflections were in English. He would plan his weekend activities in English, think about problems he needed to solve in English, even dream in English. German remained this external language that he had to consciously access and use, rather than something that flowed naturally from his thoughts. What really frustrated Thomas was watching his German colleagues switch effortlessly between German and English during international meetings. They would think and respond naturally in both languages, while Thomas felt like he needed a mental gear shift every time he moved from English to German or back again. He started to understand exactly why so many of my students tell me they feel exhausted after a day of speaking English. Thomas tried everything he could think of to solve this problem. He signed up for advanced German conversation classes, thinking that more speaking practice would help. He watched German television shows and movies without subtitles. He read German books and newspapers every day. He even started dating a German woman who only spoke German with him. But despite all this exposure and practice, his brain stubbornly continued to process German through his English thinking patterns. The breakthrough came when Thomas met Anna, a colleague from Madrid who had been living in Berlin for 5 years. Anna spoke fluent German, but more importantly, she seemed to think naturally in German. Thomas asked Anna how she had made this transition, and she shared something that surprised him. She told him that language classes and conversation practice had helped her speak German correctly, but they hadn't helped her think in German naturally. That required a completely different kind of training. Anna explained that she had learned to train her internal voice, her inner monologue, to switch languages. She told Thomas that most people focus on external communication, on speaking and listening skills, but they never train their internal communication, their thinking voice. Anna had discovered that the key to natural language thinking was learning to change the language of her internal narrator. She taught Thomas a simple technique that seemed almost too easy to work. Every morning during his commute to work, instead of letting his mind wander in English as it naturally wanted to do, Thomas would force his internal voice to narrate his observations in German. Instead of thinking, "The train is crowded today," he would consciously think, "Der Zug ist heute voll." Instead of, "I need to remember to call my mother tonight," he would think, "Ich muss heute Abend meine Mutter anrufen." At first, this felt incredibly awkward and slow for Thomas. His brain resisted this internal German narration because English was so much easier and faster. But Anna encouraged him to be patient and consistent. She told him that building new thinking patterns takes time, just like building physical muscle through exercise. Thomas committed to practicing this internal German narration for just 15 minutes each day during his morning commute. After 1 week, he noticed that the German internal voice felt slightly less forced, slightly more natural. After 2 weeks, he caught himself spontaneously thinking a complete German sentence without having to consciously force it. After 3 weeks, something remarkable happened. Thomas woke up one Saturday morning and realized that his first thoughts of the day had been in German. Not translated from English to German, but originally conceived in German. He had thought "Ich bin müde" rather than "I am tired," translated into "Ich bin müde." His brain had created a German thought directly, without going through English first. From that point forward, Thomas noticed rapid improvement in his natural German thinking ability. German conversations became more fluid and spontaneous because he wasn't constantly translating. He could respond with jokes and quick comments because his German thoughts were flowing at the same speed as his English thoughts had always flowed. Thomas told me that this experience gave him tremendous empathy for language learners and made him realize that thinking in a new language is a specific skill that needs to be practiced separately from speaking, listening, reading, or writing skills. Let me share something fascinating with you about how your brain actually works with languages, and why understanding this will completely change how patient and kind you are with yourself during this learning process. Your brain is the most incredible learning machine that has ever existed. And right now, as you're listening to me speak, your brain is doing something absolutely amazing without you even realizing it. Think about this for a moment. You're hearing sounds coming from your device, just vibrations in the air, but your brain is instantly turning those sounds into meaningful words, then into concepts, then into emotions and understanding. This happens so fast that you don't even notice the process. But this incredible ability didn't happen overnight. Your brain spent years building the pathways that make this automatic understanding possible. When you were a baby, your brain was like a construction site, constantly building roads and highways for information to travel on. Every time you heard your native language, every time someone spoke to you, read to you, or you heard conversations around you, your brain was laying down tracks, creating connections, building superhighways for that language. By the time you were 5 or 6 years old, These pathways had become so strong and automatic that thinking in your native language required no conscious effort whatsoever. Here's what's really important to understand. Your brain didn't just learn words and sounds. Your brain learned to associate your native language with everything in your life. Every emotion you felt as a child, every experience you had, every relationship you formed, every memory you created was encoded in your native language. When you feel happy, your brain automatically thinks happiness words in your native language. When you're frustrated, when you're excited, when you're confused, your brain reaches for your native language because that's where all your emotional and experiential connections are stored. This is why thinking in English feels so challenging. It's not just that you're learning new words or new ways to express ideas. You're asking your brain to create entirely new highways, new connections, new associations for a language that doesn't have all those deep emotional and experiential roots. Your English pathways are like narrow country roads compared to the 8-lane superhighways of your native language. But here's the beautiful part, and this is what I want you to really understand. Your brain has an incredible ability called neuroplasticity. This means that your brain can create new pathways and strengthen them at any age. You're not too old, it's not too late, and your brain is absolutely capable of building strong English thinking pathways. The key is understanding how this process works so you can work with your brain instead of fighting against it. When you repeatedly use the same thought patterns, your brain strengthens those pathways. Think of it like walking through a field. The first time you walk across that field, you're pushing through tall grass, creating just a faint path. But if you walk that same route every day, eventually you'll have a clear, well-worn path that's easy and natural to follow. Your native language pathways are like highways, because you've been walking those routes every single day of your life. Your English pathways are still like that first walk through tall grass because you haven't repeated them enough times yet. This is why traditional language learning sometimes feels so frustrating. Most language courses focus on teaching you vocabulary and sentence structures, but they don't teach you how to train your brain to naturally choose the English pathways over your native language pathways. It's like having a beautiful new road built in your town, but you keep driving on the old familiar highway, because that's what feels automatic and natural. Your brain is designed to be efficient. It wants to use the pathways that are fastest and require the least energy. This is actually a good thing in most areas of life, but when you're learning to think in English, this efficiency works against you. Your brain says, "Why should I struggle to think in English when I can think so much faster and easier in your native language?" This is completely normal and natural. Your brain isn't being lazy or stubborn. Your brain is just doing what brains do, trying to help you by using the most efficient pathways available. Understanding this process helps you be patient with yourself when English thinking feels slow or difficult. It also helps you understand why consistency is so much more important than intensity when it comes to building English thinking habits. You can't build strong neural pathways by studying English for 8 hours one day and then not practicing for a week. That would be like trying to create that path across the field by running back and forth frantically for one afternoon, and then not walking that route again for days. The path would disappear. But if you walk that path for just 10 minutes every single day, within a few weeks, you'll have a clear, reliable route. Neural pathways work exactly the same way. Short, consistent practice is far more effective than long, irregular practice sessions, because repetition is what strengthens connections in your brain. This is also why you might notice that some English thoughts come more naturally than others. If you've repeated certain English phrases or concepts many times, your brain has started to build stronger pathways for those specific ideas. You might find that you naturally think certain work-related phrases in English, or certain everyday activities in English because those are the areas where you've had the most repeated practice. There's another fascinating aspect of how your brain handles multiple languages. Your brain doesn't actually store different languages in completely separate areas. Instead, languages share many of the same regions and networks in your brain. This is actually good news because it means the language learning infrastructure is already there. You don't need to build entirely new brain regions for English. You need to train existing regions to create new patterns and associations. When you practice thinking in English consistently, you're not just memorizing new information. You're literally rewiring your brain, creating new automatic responses, building new default pathways. The thoughts that feel forced and slow today will eventually become as automatic and effortless as your native language thoughts, but only if you give your brain enough repetition and time to build those pathways. I want to tell you about Sophie, a young woman from Paris who completely transformed her relationship with English in just 2 months using a technique that most people never even think to practice. Sophie had always been fascinated by American culture and movies. She would spend her evenings watching Hollywood films, completely captivated by how naturally and effortlessly the characters expressed themselves in English. She dreamed of one day thinking and feeling in English the way those actors did, with such fluidity and emotional authenticity. Sophie had been studying English since she was 12 years old. She took classes in school, attended evening conversation groups at the local language center, and even hired a private tutor for individual lessons. Her English was technically quite good. She could read English novels, understand complex movies without subtitles, and hold detailed conversations about work, hobbies, and current events. But despite all this progress, something was missing that frustrated her deeply. Every time Sophie tried to express herself in English, she felt like she was performing rather than simply being herself. Her thoughts would form in French first, then she would carefully translate them into English before speaking. This translation process made her feel artificial and disconnected from her own words. She could communicate effectively, but she couldn't communicate authentically. She felt like there was a glass wall between her real self and her English-speaking self. What bothered Sophie most was watching American movies and seeing characters have spontaneous, emotional conversations where their words seemed to flow directly from their hearts without any mental processing time. She wanted to laugh naturally in English, to express anger authentically in English, to share excitement genuinely in English. But every emotion she tried to express in English felt filtered through French first, losing its spontaneity and natural warmth in the translation process. Sophie tried everything she could think of to solve this problem. She bought advanced grammar books, thinking that maybe better technical knowledge would help her think more naturally. She enrolled in more conversation classes, hoping that additional speaking practice would break through this mental barrier. She even traveled to London for a 2-week intensive English course, surrounding herself with English speakers and forcing herself to use English constantly. But even after all these efforts, Sophie returned to Paris still feeling like an English translator rather than an English thinker. She could speak more confidently and make fewer mistakes, but the fundamental problem remained unchanged. Her English thoughts still felt foreign and artificial, like wearing clothes that didn't quite fit properly. The breakthrough came completely by accident during a particularly frustrating week at work. Sophie had been assigned to work on a project with American colleagues, and she was spending hours every day in video conferences conducted entirely in English. By the end of each day, she felt mentally exhausted from the constant translation effort her brain was doing. On Friday evening, Sophie was walking home from work, feeling tired and discouraged about her English progress. As she walked through the streets of Paris, her mind was wandering, processing the events of the day. Suddenly, she realized something strange was happening. She was thinking about her work problems in English, not translating French thoughts into English, but actually thinking original thoughts in English. This realization was so surprising that Sophie stopped walking and stood still on the sidewalk, trying to understand what had just happened. She had been so mentally fatigued from using English all day that her brain had apparently forgotten to switch back to French mode. For just a few minutes, English had become her natural thinking language. Sophie realized that this accidental experience had shown her something important. Her brain was capable of thinking naturally in English, but only when she wasn't consciously trying to force it. The key wasn't more studying or more conversation practice. The key was training her internal monologue, her private thinking voice, to operate in English. That weekend, Sophie decided to experiment with this discovery. Instead of waiting for accidental moments of English thinking, she would deliberately practice thinking in English during routine daily activities. She started with simple activities like making coffee in the morning, describing each step to herself in English rather than French. At first, this internal English narration felt awkward and slow. Sophie would think, "I am putting water in the coffee machine," and it felt forced and unnatural compared to her effortless French thoughts. But she persisted, narrating her morning routine in English every single day, treating it like mental exercise rather than language study. Within the first week, Sophie noticed that the English internal narration was becoming slightly easier. She wasn't translating from French anymore during these practice sessions. Instead, she was creating simple English thoughts directly. The thoughts were basic and sometimes grammatically imperfect, but they were authentically English thoughts rather than translated French thoughts. By the second week, Sophie expanded her internal English practice to other daily activities. She would think in English while walking to work, describing the people she saw, the weather, her plans for the day. She practiced internal English conversations while cooking dinner, imagining discussions she might have with colleagues or friends. The most significant breakthrough came during the third week when Sophie realized she had been planning her weekend activities in English without consciously deciding to do so. Her brain had spontaneously chosen English for internal planning and decision-making, just as it had done that first accidental evening after work. By the end of the first month, Sophie noticed that her English conversations at work felt completely different. She was responding more quickly and naturally because her thoughts were already forming in English rather than requiring translation. Her colleagues commented that she seemed more relaxed and authentic when speaking English, though they couldn't identify exactly what had changed. The most amazing transformation happened during the second month. Sophie was watching one of her favorite American movies, and she realized she was emotionally connecting with the dialogue in a completely new way. She wasn't just understanding the words and meaning, she was feeling the emotions in English. When characters were sad, she felt sadness in English words. When they were excited, her internal response was in English thoughts and feelings. Sophie told me that this emotional connection in English was the missing piece she had been searching for all along. She finally understood why the movie characters seemed so authentic and natural. They weren't translating their emotions into English. They were experiencing their emotions directly in English. And now Sophie could do the same thing. By the end of 2 months, Sophie's internal monologue had become naturally bilingual. She would think in French during some activities and English during others, depending on context and mood. Most importantly, both languages felt authentic and natural to her. Now I want to teach you the first technique that will begin transforming your brain into an English thinking machine. This is the same method that helped Sophie from Paris and countless other students break through that mental translation barrier. It's called daily mental narration, and it's so simple that you might be tempted to dismiss it as too easy to work. But I promise you, this technique is incredibly powerful because it works directly with how your brain creates automatic thinking patterns. Here's how it works. Right now, as you go through your daily routine, your brain is constantly narrating your activities in your native language. When you wake up in the morning, your brain thinks something like, "I'm tired," or "I need coffee," or "What time is it?" When you're getting ready for work, your brain is thinking, "Where did I put my keys?" or "I should check the weather," or "I'm running late today." This internal narration happens automatically, without any conscious effort from you. What we're going to do is train your brain to do this same automatic narration in English instead of your native language. We're going to start with the simplest, most routine activities, because these are the easiest places for your brain to create new patterns. When you're doing something you've done thousands of times before, like brushing your teeth or making coffee, your actions are automatic, which means your brain has extra capacity to focus on the language practice. Let me walk you through exactly how to begin. Tomorrow morning, when you wake up and start your daily routine, I want you to consciously narrate just one simple activity in English. Let's start with walking to the bathroom. Instead of letting your brain think in your native language, deliberately think, "I am walking to the bathroom." That's it, just that one simple sentence. When you're brushing your teeth, think, "I am brushing my teeth." When you're washing your face, think, "I am washing my face." When you're walking to the kitchen, think, "I am walking to the kitchen." These thoughts might feel strange and artificial at first, because your brain is used to thinking these routine thoughts in your native language without any conscious effort. The key is to start incredibly small and simple. Don't try to narrate your entire morning routine in English on the first day. That would overwhelm your brain and make the practice feel difficult and unnatural. Instead, choose just 3 or 4 basic activities and practice thinking about them in English. Your goal isn't to think complex or interesting thoughts. Your goal is to train your brain to choose English pathways instead of your native language pathways for automatic thinking. Here's what I want you to understand about why this technique is so effective. When you narrate simple daily activities in English, you're teaching your brain that English can be a language for ordinary, routine thinking, not just for special occasions like conversations or presentations. Most English learners only use English when they're actively trying to communicate with someone else. But your internal thinking voice is active all day long, processing hundreds of thoughts and observations. By training your internal voice to use English during routine activities, you're giving your brain massive amounts of English thinking practice without requiring any extra time in your schedule. You're brushing your teeth anyway. You're walking to the kitchen anyway. You're getting dressed anyway. Now these routine activities become English practice opportunities. Start with present tense narration because it's the most natural and immediate. I am opening the door. I am turning on the light. I am putting on my shoes. Don't worry about using perfect or sophisticated language. The goal is repetition and consistency, not complexity or accuracy. Simple, basic English thoughts repeated consistently will build stronger neural pathways than complex English thoughts practiced occasionally. After you've been practicing basic narration for a week, you can begin to expand slightly. Instead of just, I am making coffee, you might think, I am making coffee because I'm tired, or I am making strong coffee today. But resist the temptation to make these thoughts too complicated too quickly. Your brain needs time to get comfortable with basic English thinking before you add layers of complexity. One thing that students often ask me is what to do when they can't think of the English word for something during their narration practice. This is completely normal and expected. When this happens, don't stop your practice to look up the word or translate it from your native language. Instead, just skip that word and continue with what you can express in English. For example, if you can't remember the word towel, just think, I am drying my hands with the thing, and move on. The goal is maintaining the flow of English thinking, not perfect vocabulary. This technique works because it creates positive associations between English and your daily life. Instead of English being a special language that you only use for work or study, English becomes integrated into your ordinary experiences. Your brain begins to see English as a natural choice for internal dialogue, rather than something foreign that requires special effort. The most important aspect of this practice is consistency, rather than duration or complexity. Spending 5 minutes each morning narrating simple activities in English will be far more effective than spending an hour once a week trying to think complex thoughts in English. Your brain builds automatic patterns through repetition, and daily repetition creates stronger pathways than intensive but irregular practice. Many students tell me they feel silly talking to themselves in English during routine activities. This feeling is completely normal. Remember that this internal narration is completely private. Nobody else can hear your thoughts. You're not performing for anyone or trying to impress anyone. You're simply training your brain to choose English pathways instead of your native language pathways for routine thinking. Within the first week of consistent practice, you should notice that the English narration begins to feel slightly more natural and requires less conscious effort. Within 2 weeks, you might catch yourself spontaneously thinking an English thought during your routine without having consciously decided to practice. This spontaneous English thinking is exactly what we're working toward. The beautiful thing about this technique is that once you establish the habit with morning routine activities, you can gradually expand it to other parts of your day. You can practice English narration while walking somewhere, while cooking, while cleaning, while exercising. Any routine activity becomes an opportunity to strengthen your English thinking pathways. Let me share with you Marco's incredible transformation story, because it perfectly demonstrates how the mental narration technique can solve a very specific and frustrating problem that many of you probably face every single day. Marco lived in Rome and worked as a professional tour guide, leading groups of international tourists through the ancient streets and historical sites of his beautiful city. His job required him to be fluent and engaging in English, and from an outside perspective, Marco appeared to be completely bilingual. Marco could read English newspapers and novels without any difficulty. He understood English movies, podcasts, and conversations perfectly. He had an extensive English vocabulary and could explain complex historical concepts, architectural details, and cultural traditions to his tourist groups with impressive accuracy and depth. His English knowledge was sophisticated and comprehensive, and tourists often complimented him on his excellent command of the language. But Marco had a secret struggle that was making his job increasingly stressful and exhausting. Every single day, he had to constantly switch back and forth between thinking in Italian and speaking in English, and this mental switching was wearing him down. When Italian tourists asked him questions, he would naturally think and respond in Italian. But when English-speaking tourists asked similar questions just minutes later, his brain would have to consciously shift gears, translate his Italian knowledge into English, and then deliver the response. This constant mental switching meant that Marco's English responses were always slightly delayed. There would be a brief pause while his brain processed the question, accessed his knowledge in Italian, translated that knowledge to English, and then formulated an appropriate response. These pauses were brief, usually just a second or two, but they made Marco feel self-conscious and unnatural during his tours. What frustrated Marco most was that he knew the English information perfectly well. He had given the same historical explanations hundreds of times. He knew all the vocabulary, all the facts, all the stories. But his brain insisted on processing everything through Italian first, making his English feel forced and artificial rather than smooth and spontaneous. Marco was particularly embarrassed during mixed groups where he had both Italian and English-speaking tourists. He would explain something naturally and fluently in Italian, and then when he tried to provide the same explanation in English, the contrast was obvious. His Italian was animated, passionate, and effortless. His English was accurate but mechanical, like he was reading from a script rather than sharing his genuine enthusiasm for Roman history. The problem became even more apparent during question and answer sessions. When Italian tourists asked spontaneous questions, Marco could respond immediately with interesting anecdotes, personal observations, and engaging details that brought the history to life. But when English-speaking tourists asked similar questions, Marco would pause, think, and deliver more formal, less personal responses because his brain was working so hard on the language translation that it couldn't access his natural storytelling personality. Marco tried various solutions to this problem. He practiced his tour scripts in English, memorizing key phrases and explanations. He studied English pronunciation to make his delivery smoother. He even took advanced conversation classes to improve his spontaneous speaking skills. All of these efforts helped him speak more correctly and confidently, but they didn't solve the fundamental problem of mental translation delay. The breakthrough came when Marco decided to try the mental narration technique during his daily morning walks through Rome. Marco lived in Trastevere and walked to work every morning through some of the most beautiful streets in the city. These walks usually took about 20 minutes, and Marco's mind would naturally wander in Italian, thinking about his plans for the day, observing the people and activities around him, and mentally preparing for his tours. Marco decided to use these morning walks as English thinking practice. Instead of letting his mind wander in Italian as usual, he began deliberately narrating his observations and thoughts in English. When he passed the local bakery, instead of thinking in Italian about the delicious smell, he would consciously think, "The bakery smells amazing this morning," or "The baker is preparing fresh bread for the day." At first, this English narration felt awkward and slow during his walks. Marco would see something interesting, like street musicians or a beautiful sunrise, and his brain would automatically form Italian thoughts about what he was experiencing. He had to consciously catch these Italian thoughts and translate them into English, which initially felt like more mental work rather than less. But Marco persisted with this practice because he understood that he was training his brain to create new automatic patterns. Every morning he walked the same route through Rome, but now he was experiencing that familiar journey through English thoughts instead of Italian thoughts. He was teaching his brain that English could be a natural language for observation, reflection, and spontaneous thinking, not just for formal tour presentations. After 1 week of consistent morning English narration, Marco noticed something interesting. The English thoughts during his walks were beginning to feel less forced and more natural. He wasn't translating as much from Italian. Instead, he was starting to have original English thoughts about what he was seeing and experiencing. After 2 weeks, Marco realized that his morning English thinking practice was starting to affect his work performance. During his tours, he noticed that he was responding to English-speaking tourists slightly more quickly than before. The mental pause between hearing their questions and formulating his responses was becoming shorter and less noticeable. The real breakthrough came during the 3rd week. Marco was leading a tour of the Colosseum, when an English-speaking tourist asked him about gladiator training methods. Instead of his usual process of thinking about the answer in Italian and then translating it to English, Marco found himself thinking directly about gladiator training in English and responding immediately with the same natural enthusiasm he usually showed with Italian tourists. After that day, Marco noticed that his English responses were becoming increasingly automatic and natural. His brain was beginning to store historical information and personal observations in English rather than just in Italian. When he walked past Roman monuments during his morning practice walks, he would naturally think about their history in English. And this English historical thinking transferred directly to his professional tours. Within 6 weeks, Marco's colleagues and tourists began commenting that his English presentations seemed more animated and engaging than before. Marco realized that his personality was finally coming through in English because he was no longer spending mental energy on translation processes. I want to tell you about Anna from Berlin, whose story will probably sound very familiar to many of you listening right now. Anna had been learning English for several years and had reached what most people would consider an advanced level. She could understand complex English texts, follow detailed presentations at work, and participate in international video conferences with colleagues from around the world. But Anna struggled with something that made her feel frustrated and embarrassed about her English abilities. Anna's problem was that she could never maintain consistent English thinking for more than a few sentences at a time. She would start thinking about something in English, perhaps planning what to say in an upcoming meeting or reflecting on a conversation she had with an English-speaking colleague. But invariably, after just a sentence or two of English thinking, her brain would unconsciously slip back into German without her even noticing. This constant language switching in her thoughts made Anna feel like she was failing at English in a very personal way. It was one thing to make mistakes when speaking with others, but when she couldn't even maintain English consistency in her private thoughts, it felt like evidence that she would never truly master the language. Anna described this to me as feeling like her brain was betraying her English learning efforts. The most frustrating part for Anna was that this mental language mixing would happen even when she was consciously trying to think in English. She would decide to spend her lunch break thinking through an English presentation she needed to give, deliberately choosing to use only English for this mental preparation. But within minutes, she would catch herself thinking key concepts in German, using German words for technical terms, or organizing her thoughts using German sentence structures. Anna noticed this problem most clearly during her daily commute to work. She would board the train each morning intending to use the 30-minute journey for English thinking practice. She would start by thinking about her plans for the day in English, but by the time she reached her office, she would realize that most of her commute thinking had unconsciously reverted to German, even though she had specifically intended to practice English thinking. This pattern made Anna feel like she was stuck in a frustrating cycle. She knew that thinking in English was important for developing natural fluency, but every time she tried to maintain English thinking for extended periods, her brain would automatically return to the comfort and efficiency of German. Anna began to wonder if some people were simply incapable of truly thinking in a second language, and whether she was one of those people. The breakthrough came when Anna learned about the imaginary conversation technique and decided to give it a serious try during her daily commute. Instead of trying to maintain general English thinking about random topics, Anna began practicing specific, structured English conversations in her mind during her train rides to work. Anna started with the most basic scenarios that she encountered regularly in her daily life. She would imagine herself ordering coffee at the cafe near her office, having the entire conversation in her mind in English. She would play both roles, thinking through what the barista might say and how she would respond, all in English. These imaginary conversations were very simple at first. "Good morning. What would you like today?" "I would like a cappuccino, please." "Would you like anything else?" "No, thank you." "How much is that?" What Anna discovered was that having structured conversations in her mind was much easier than trying to maintain general English thinking. The conversation format gave her brain a clear framework to follow, which helped prevent the unconscious switching back to German that happened during unstructured thinking. When her brain had specific conversational roles to play and responses to formulate, it was easier to stay focused on English. After practicing basic coffee shop conversations for several days, Anna noticed that she could maintain English thinking for longer periods during these imaginary conversations. She wasn't slipping back into German as frequently because her mind was engaged with the specific task of formulating conversational responses rather than wandering freely between languages. Anna then expanded her imaginary conversation practice to other common scenarios. She practiced asking for directions in English, discussing the weather with colleagues, explaining her work projects to international clients, and even having casual conversations about weekend plans. Each scenario became a structured thinking exercise that helped her brain stay in English mode for extended periods. The most significant improvement came when Anna started practicing more complex imaginary conversations during her commute. Instead of just ordering coffee, she would imagine detailed discussions about current events with English-speaking friends, presentations she needed to give at work, or explanations of German cultural concepts to international visitors. These longer, more complex imaginary conversations required sustained English thinking and helped train her brain to maintain English consistency even during elaborate thought processes. After 3 weeks of consistent imaginary conversation practice during her commute, Anna realized that she was no longer unconsciously switching back to German mid-thought during these sessions. Her brain had learned to associate the commute time with English thinking mode, and the structured conversation format made it easier to maintain that focus throughout the entire journey. The most remarkable change was that this improved English thinking consistency began transferring to other areas of Anna's life. During real conversations with English-speaking colleagues, Anna noticed that her responses were coming more naturally and quickly because her brain was already practiced at formulating English thoughts and responses through the imaginary conversation training. Anna also discovered that she could use imaginary conversations to prepare for specific, real-life English interactions. Before important meetings or presentations, she would practice the likely conversations in her mind, thinking through possible questions and her responses. This mental rehearsal made her actual English interactions feel more natural and confident because she had already practiced similar conversations in her thoughts. Within 2 months of consistent practice, Anna told me that her English thinking had become much more stable and consistent. She could maintain English thinking for long periods without unconsciously switching to German, and more importantly, English thinking was starting to feel natural rather than forced or artificial. Now I want to teach you the third technique that will help you make the transition from native language thinking to English thinking in the most natural and sustainable way possible. This technique is called gradual thought replacement, and it's designed to work with your brain's natural patterns rather than fighting against them. The key word here is gradual, because this technique recognizes that your brain needs time and patience to make this fundamental shift in thinking patterns. Here's how gradual thought replacement works. Throughout your day, your brain is constantly producing automatic thoughts in your native language. These thoughts happen without any conscious effort from you. They're reactions to what you see, reflections on what you're doing, plans for what comes next, and responses to what you experience. Most of the time, you're not even aware these thoughts are happening because they're so automatic and natural. What we're going to do is train you to become aware of these automatic native language thoughts and then gently guide your brain toward creating the same thoughts in English instead. This isn't about forcing your brain to think in English all the time. That would be overwhelming and impossible. Instead, it's about gradually increasing the percentage of your daily thoughts that happen in English rather than your native language. The first step is developing awareness of your automatic thinking patterns. For most people, this awareness doesn't exist because native language thinking is so unconscious and effortless. Start by simply noticing when you're having thoughts in your native language during routine activities. Don't try to change anything yet. Just observe and become aware of how often your brain is producing automatic thoughts throughout the day. You might notice that you think, "I'm hungry" when you're feeling hungry, or "It's cold" when you step outside and feel cold weather. You might catch yourself thinking, "I need to call my mother," when you remember you need to call your mother, or "It's raining" when you notice it's raining outside. These automatic thoughts happen dozens of times every day, but most people never pay attention to them because they feel so natural and unconscious. Once you've developed awareness of these automatic thoughts, you can begin the gentle replacement process. When you catch yourself thinking something in your native language, don't criticize yourself or feel frustrated. Instead, simply and gently repeat the same thought in English. If you thought about being hungry, just quietly think to yourself, "I am hungry." If you thought about the cold weather, gently think, it's cold. The key to making this technique successful is approaching it with patience and self-compassion. Your brain has been producing automatic thoughts in your native language for your entire life. These thinking patterns are deeply ingrained and completely natural. You cannot expect to change them overnight, and you shouldn't try to change them all at once. Instead, focus on replacing just a few automatic thoughts each day, gradually building up your English thinking habits over time. Start with the most common and simple automatic thoughts, because these will give you the most practice opportunities. Thoughts about the weather are perfect for this practice, because you probably think about weather conditions multiple times every day. Instead of automatically thinking about sunny weather, catch that thought and gently replace it with, it's sunny. Instead of thinking about rain, think, it's going to rain. Thoughts about basic needs and physical sensations are also excellent for replacement practice. Instead of thinking about thirst, think I'm thirsty. Instead of thinking about tiredness, think I'm tired. Instead of thinking about headaches, think I have a headache. These basic physical and emotional states happen regularly throughout your day, giving you consistent practice opportunities. Time-related thoughts are another category that works well for gradual replacement. Instead of thinking about being late, replace it with, it's late. Instead of thinking about being in a hurry, think, I'm in a hurry. Instead of thinking about time to go, think, it's time. These temporal thoughts occur naturally throughout your daily routine, making them perfect candidates for English replacement practice. One of the most important aspects of this technique is understanding that you don't need to replace every single native language thought with English. That would be exhausting and unrealistic. Instead, aim to replace just a few automatic thoughts each day, gradually increasing the number over time. Maybe you replace 5 thoughts today, 7 thoughts tomorrow, and 10 thoughts next week. The goal is steady, gradual progress rather than dramatic immediate change. You also don't need to worry about replacing complex or abstract thoughts at the beginning. Focus on simple, concrete thoughts that involve basic vocabulary and straightforward concepts. As your brain becomes more comfortable with English replacement patterns, you can gradually work up to more complex thoughts and ideas. It's crucial to be gentle with yourself when you forget to do replacement practice or when you notice that hours have passed without any English thinking. This is completely normal and expected. Remember that you're trying to change thinking patterns that have been automatic for decades. Progress will be gradual and sometimes inconsistent, and that's perfectly okay. One helpful strategy is to choose specific daily activities or locations as reminders for replacement practice. For example, you might decide that every time you wash your hands, you'll practice replacing one automatic thought with English. Or every time you check your phone, you'll replace one native language thought with an English equivalent. These activity-based reminders help you remember to practice without making it feel like additional work. Another effective approach is to focus on replacement practice during transition moments in your day. When you're walking from one place to another, when you're waiting for something, or when you're doing routine activities, these are natural opportunities to notice automatic thoughts and practice gentle replacement. The most rewarding aspect of this technique is that over time, your brain will begin producing some automatic thoughts in English without any conscious effort from you. You might suddenly realize that you thought, I'm hungry, instead of your native language equivalent, without having consciously decided to practice English thinking. These spontaneous English thoughts are signs that your brain is successfully building new automatic patterns. I need to have a very honest conversation with you about something that might be the most important part of your English thinking journey, and that's the role of patience in this entire process. I know that patience isn't what you want to hear about right now. You probably want me to tell you that you can transform your English thinking in a few days or weeks, that there's some secret shortcut that will make everything click into place immediately. But the truth is, developing natural English thinking is like building physical strength, and I want you to understand exactly what that means for your journey. When someone decides to get physically fit, they don't expect to lift heavy weights on their first day at the gym. They understand that their muscles need time to adapt, to grow stronger, to develop the capacity for more challenging exercises. They know that trying to lift too much too soon will result in injury and setbacks rather than progress. Building English thinking pathways in your brain works exactly the same way, and understanding this comparison will help you approach your learning with the right mindset and expectations. Your native language thinking pathways are like muscles you've been exercising every single day of your life. They're incredibly strong, incredibly fast, and incredibly efficient. They can handle any mental task you throw at them without effort or fatigue. Your English thinking pathways, on the other hand, are like muscles you've never exercised before. They're weak, they're slow, and they get tired quickly. But just like physical muscles, they can become stronger with consistent, patient training. This means that your first attempts at English thinking will feel awkward, slow, and effortful, just like your first attempts at exercise feel challenging and uncomfortable. This doesn't mean you're doing something wrong or that you're not capable of improvement. It means you're doing exactly what you should be doing, which is challenging your brain to develop new capabilities that don't exist yet. I want you to understand that feeling frustrated during this process is not a sign of failure. Frustration is actually a sign that your brain is working hard to create new pathways and patterns. When you feel that mental strain during English thinking practice, when it feels difficult and unnatural, that's the feeling of your brain literally building new neural connections. It's the same feeling you would have in your muscles after a good workout, that sensation that tells you growth and strengthening is happening. One of the biggest mistakes I see English learners make is expecting their English thinking to feel natural and effortless from the beginning. They try English thinking practice for a few days or weeks, and when it still feels forced and artificial, they conclude that they're not making progress or that the technique isn't working for them. This is like going to the gym 3 times and expecting to see dramatic physical changes, then giving up when you don't look like a professional athlete yet. The reality is that meaningful brain change happens slowly and often invisibly. You might practice English thinking techniques for weeks without noticing any obvious improvement, and then suddenly realize that something has shifted. You might catch yourself having a spontaneous English thought, or notice that English thinking feels slightly easier than it did before, or find that you can maintain English thinking for a few more minutes than when you started. These small improvements might seem insignificant compared to your ultimate goal of natural English thinking, but they represent real, measurable changes in your brain structure and function. Every moment you spend practicing English thinking, even when it feels difficult and unproductive, your brain is creating and strengthening the pathways that will eventually make English thinking feel natural and automatic. I often tell my students to think about learning to walk as a child. Nobody expects a baby to stand up and walk perfectly on their first attempt. Babies fall down hundreds of times before they can take a few steady steps. They wobble, they stumble, they grab onto furniture for support. But nobody looks at a falling baby and concludes that this child will never learn to walk. Everyone understands that falling down is part of the learning process, not evidence of inability. Your English thinking development follows the same pattern. You will have days when English thinking feels easier and more natural, and you will have days when it feels forced and difficult. You will have moments of breakthrough and moments of seeming regression. You will sometimes feel like you're making rapid progress, and other times feel like you're stuck in the same place. All of this variation is completely normal and expected. What matters most is not the speed of your progress or the consistency of your improvement, but the fact that you continue practicing despite the challenges and setbacks. Every time you choose to practice English thinking when it feels difficult, every time you return to practice after a discouraging day, every time you persist through frustration and mental fatigue, you're developing not just English thinking skills, but also the mental resilience that makes long-term learning possible. I want you to celebrate the small victories along the way, because these small victories are actually huge accomplishments when you understand what your brain is doing. The first time you have a spontaneous English thought, that's worth celebrating. The first time you maintain English thinking for 5 consecutive minutes, that's an achievement. The first time English thinking feels slightly more natural than it did the week before, that's evidence of real progress. Remember that everyone's brain develops English thinking patterns at a different pace. Some people notice changes within days, others need weeks or months. This variation doesn't reflect intelligence, language aptitude, or ultimate potential for success. It simply reflects the fact that every brain is unique and responds to training differently. Comparing your progress to someone else's progress is like comparing your physical fitness journey to someone else's. Despite having different starting points, different genetics, and different life circumstances. The most important thing you can do for your English thinking development is to commit to consistent practice regardless of how you feel about your progress on any given day. Trust that your brain is changing even when you can't see or feel the changes happening. Trust that patient, persistent practice will eventually lead to the natural English thinking you're working toward. And most importantly, be kind to yourself throughout this process, recognizing that you're attempting something genuinely challenging and worthwhile. Let me tell you about Carlos from Barcelona, whose story perfectly illustrates why patience and celebrating small victories can make the difference between success and giving up in your English thinking journey. Carlos was a perfectionist by nature, the type of person who excelled at everything he put his mind to. He had advanced degrees, a successful career in international business, and a track record of achieving his goals quickly and efficiently. This mindset had served him well throughout his life, but it was actually working against him when it came to developing natural English thinking. Carlos had been studying English for years and had reached an impressive level of proficiency. He could negotiate complex business deals in English, write detailed reports, and deliver presentations to international audiences. His colleagues considered him fluent, and from the outside, his English abilities appeared flawless. But Carlos knew that something fundamental was missing from his English experience, and it frustrated him deeply. The problem was that Carlos could never escape the mental translation process that made his English feel artificial and effortful. Every English conversation required intense concentration and mental energy, because his brain was constantly working to translate thoughts from Spanish to English and back again. Carlos felt like he was performing English, rather than simply being himself in English, and this feeling bothered him tremendously. When Carlos first learned about English thinking techniques, he approached them with the same intense, goal-oriented mindset that had brought him success in other areas of his life. He committed to practicing mental narration, imaginary conversations, and thought replacement for several hours every day. He expected to see dramatic improvements within the first week, and he monitored his progress carefully, looking for signs of breakthrough and transformation. After 1 week of intensive practice, Carlos felt frustrated because English thinking still felt forced and unnatural. After 2 weeks, he was disappointed that he hadn't experienced the spontaneous English thoughts he was hoping for. After 3 weeks, Carlos concluded that these techniques weren't working for him, and that he might be one of those people who simply couldn't develop natural English thinking abilities. Carlos's pattern was to practice intensively for a few days, become discouraged when he didn't see immediate dramatic results, and then abandon his practice for weeks at a time. He would restart his English thinking practice periodically, but always with the same impatient expectations and the same inevitable disappointment when progress didn't match his timeline. This cycle continued for several months until Carlos had a conversation with his colleague Patricia, who had successfully transitioned from Spanish thinking to natural bilingual thinking over the course of 2 years. Patricia listened to Carlos describe his frustrations and then asked him a question that changed his entire perspective on the learning process. Patricia asked Carlos whether he would expect to run a marathon after training for only 3 weeks, or whether he would expect to play piano beautifully after practicing for just a few hours. Carlos immediately recognized the absurdity of these expectations, but he realized that he had been applying exactly the same unrealistic timeline to his English thinking development. Patricia helped Carlos understand that his perfectionist mindset was actually sabotaging his learning process. Instead of appreciating the small improvements that were actually happening, Carlos was focused only on the dramatic transformation he thought should be occurring. He was missing the real progress because he was looking for the wrong kind of progress. Patricia suggested that Carlos change his approach entirely. Instead of practicing for hours each day and expecting major breakthroughs, she recommended that Carlos practice for just 10 minutes each morning and focus on noticing and celebrating tiny improvements rather than waiting for dramatic changes. Carlos was skeptical about this approach because it seemed too gentle and gradual compared to his usual intensive learning style. But he decided to try Patricia's suggestion because his current approach clearly wasn't working. Carlos began practicing mental narration during his morning coffee routine, spending just 10 minutes thinking through his daily plans in English. Instead of judging whether this practice felt natural or effortless, Carlos focused on simply completing the 10 minutes consistently every day and noticing any small changes in how the practice felt. After 1 week of this gentler approach, Carlos noticed that he could complete his 10-minute English thinking session without feeling mentally exhausted, whereas previously English thinking had felt draining and effortful. This was a small change, but Carlos celebrated it as evidence that his brain was adapting to English thinking practice. After 2 weeks, Carlos realized that he had thought an entire complex sentence in English without having to pause and construct it word by word. The sentence was about his weekend plans, and it had flowed naturally from his thoughts rather than being consciously assembled. Carlos felt excited about this small victory and decided to continue his patient approach. After 3 weeks, Carlos caught himself having a brief imaginary conversation in English with a colleague about a work project. The conversation lasted only about 30 seconds, but it happened spontaneously without Carlos having consciously decided to practice imaginary conversations. Carlos recognized this as significant progress and felt motivated to continue his consistent daily practice. The breakthrough Carlos had been hoping for came after 6 weeks of patient, consistent practice. Carlos woke up on a Saturday morning and went through his entire morning routine, thinking naturally in English about what he wanted to do with his day, how he was feeling, and what he needed to accomplish. It wasn't until mid-morning that Carlos realized he had been thinking in English for over 2 hours without any conscious effort or decision to do so. This natural English thinking session felt completely different from his previous forced practice sessions. The English thoughts felt authentic and effortless, flowing at the same speed and with the same natural quality as his Spanish thoughts. Carlos finally understood what natural bilingual thinking felt like, and he realized that all his previous patient practice had been building toward this moment of breakthrough. From that point forward, Carlos experienced increasingly frequent episodes of spontaneous English thinking. His brain had finally developed strong enough English pathways to support natural, automatic thinking processes. More importantly, Carlos had learned the value of patience, consistency, and celebrating small improvements rather than demanding immediate dramatic results. Carlos told me that learning to be patient with his English thinking development taught him valuable lessons about learning in general that he applied to other areas of his life. Now I want to share with you the fourth and perhaps most powerful technique for developing natural English thinking, and that's visual and emotional association. This technique works differently from the others because it helps your brain create direct connections between English words and your actual experiences, completely bypassing the translation process that keeps you stuck in your native language patterns. When you master this technique, English words will trigger the same immediate understanding and emotional response as words in your native language. Let me explain how this works by describing what happens in your brain when you think in your native language. When you think the word for home in your native language, your brain doesn't translate that word into some other language first. Instead, it immediately connects to all your memories, feelings, and associations with home. You might instantly visualize your childhood house, feel warmth and safety, remember family dinners, or experience whatever emotions the concept of home brings up for you. This happens in milliseconds, completely automatically, without any conscious effort from you. The problem with traditional English learning is that English words usually get connected to your native language words, rather than directly to your experiences and emotions. When you hear or think the English word home, your brain first translates it to your native language equivalent, and then accesses all those memories and feelings. This translation step creates delay and makes English feel artificial, because you're experiencing English through the filter of your native language rather than directly. Visual and emotional association training teaches your brain to connect English words directly to your experiences, memories, and feelings, just like your native language words do. When you successfully create these direct connections, thinking the English word home will immediately trigger the same visual images, memories, and emotions that your native language word for home triggers, without any translation step in between. Here's how to practice this technique in your daily life. Start with concrete objects that you encounter regularly throughout your day. When you see your coffee cup in the morning, don't just think the English word cup. Instead, really look at the cup. Notice its color, its shape, the way the light reflects on its surface. Feel its weight in your hands, notice the temperature and texture, then think the English word cup while you're having this direct sensory experience with the actual object. The key is to create the English word association while you're actively experiencing the object with your senses, not just thinking about it abstractly. Your brain will begin to associate the English word cup with all these sensory details and experiences, creating a direct pathway that doesn't require translation from your native language. Practice this same technique with everything you encounter throughout your day. When you touch a door handle, feel its coolness and smooth surface while thinking door handle. When you feel warm sunlight on your skin, experience that physical sensation while thinking warm sunlight. When you smell fresh bread from a bakery, breathe in that aroma while thinking fresh bread. You're training your brain to connect English words directly to sensory experiences rather than to native language translations. This technique becomes even more powerful when you apply it to emotions and feelings. Instead of translating emotional words from your native language to English, create direct associations between English emotion words and your actual emotional experiences. The next time you feel genuinely happy about something, whether it's hearing good news, spending time with loved ones, or accomplishing something important, think the English word happy while you're actually experiencing that emotion. Don't think your native language word for happiness and then translate it to English. Instead, feel the actual emotion in your body. Notice how happiness feels physically, and think, I feel happy, or I am happy, while that genuine emotion is flowing through you. This creates a direct connection between the English word and your authentic emotional experience. You can do this with all emotions as they naturally occur throughout your day. When you feel frustrated in traffic, experience that frustration physically and mentally while thinking, I feel frustrated. When you feel excited about weekend plans, connect that excitement directly to the English words, I feel excited, without going through your native language first. Visual association works similarly. Instead of thinking English words and then trying to remember what they mean, connect English words directly to visual images in your mind. When you think beach, don't translate from your native language word for beach. Instead, immediately visualize a specific beach you've visited or seen in photos. See the sand, the waves, the blue water, people walking along the shore. Connect the English word beach directly to these vivid visual images. Practice this with abstract concepts as well. When you think the English word freedom, don't translate it from your native language concept of freedom. Instead, immediately connect it to specific experiences or images that represent freedom to you. Maybe you visualize birds flying, or remember a time when you felt completely free and unrestricted, or imagine wide-open spaces. The goal is to make the English word trigger immediate visual and emotional associations, rather than requiring a translation step. You can also use this technique to build stronger connections with English words you already know, but that still feel foreign or artificial. Take any English word that you understand intellectually, but that doesn't feel natural when you think or say it. Spend time creating rich sensory, visual, and emotional associations with that word using real experiences from your life. For example, if the English word delicious still feels translated and artificial, the next time you eat something that tastes amazing, really focus on that taste experience while thinking, this is delicious. Let the English word become connected to the actual sensation of great taste, rather than to your native language word for delicious. The most advanced version of this technique involves creating English associations with complex experiences and situations. When you have a wonderful conversation with a friend, a successful day at work, or a beautiful sunset experience, think about these experiences using English words while they're happening or immediately afterward. This helps English become the natural language for processing and remembering meaningful life experiences. This associative approach takes more conscious effort initially than simple translation, but it creates much stronger and more natural English thinking patterns because it connects English directly to your life experiences rather than to your native language system. I want to tell you about Elena from Madrid, whose emotional breakthrough in English demonstrates exactly why the visual and emotional association technique can be so transformative for developing authentic English thinking. Elena was a psychology graduate student who had excellent technical English skills. She could read complex academic papers, write research proposals, and participate in international conferences with impressive fluency. But Elena struggled with something that went much deeper than vocabulary or sentence structure. Elena felt like she had two completely different personalities, one in Spanish and one in English. Her Spanish personality was warm, expressive, passionate, and emotionally authentic. She could express subtle feelings, make emotional connections with people, and communicate the full depth of her thoughts and experiences. but her English personality felt cold, formal, and emotionally distant. Even when Elena was trying to express positive emotions like excitement or affection in English, the words felt artificial and disconnected from what she was actually feeling inside. This emotional disconnect in English was particularly challenging for Elena because of her field of study. As a psychology student, she needed to discuss complex emotional concepts, understand the nuanced feelings of research subjects, and express empathy and understanding in therapeutic contexts. Elena could use all the correct English terminology for emotions, but she couldn't access the authentic emotional experience that gave those words real meaning and power. Elena described this problem to me as feeling like she was wearing an emotional mask when speaking English. She could say, "I feel sad," or "I feel excited," or "I feel grateful." But these English emotion words felt like academic labels rather than expressions of genuine feeling. When Elena said, "I feel happy" in English, it was like reading from a textbook definition of happiness, rather than expressing actual happiness that she was experiencing in her body and mind. The most frustrating aspect of this emotional disconnect was that Elena knew she was capable of deep emotional expression because she experienced it constantly in Spanish. When Elena felt joy in Spanish, the feeling was immediate, authentic, and powerful. When she tried to express that same joy in English, it felt filtered, translated, and somehow diminished. Elena began to worry that this emotional limitation in English would prevent her from being effective in international psychological research and practice. Elena had tried various approaches to solve this problem, including studying English emotional vocabulary, practicing emotional conversations with native English speakers, and even watching English movies to observe emotional expression. These efforts helped her understand English emotional language intellectually, but they didn't help her access authentic emotional experience in English. The breakthrough came when Elena learned about emotional association techniques and decided to apply them specifically to her emotional vocabulary development. Instead of trying to learn English emotion words by translating them from Spanish or memorizing their definitions, Elena began creating direct connections between English emotion words and her actual emotional experiences as they happened throughout her daily life. Elena started with basic positive emotions because these felt safer and more manageable for practice. When Elena experienced genuine happiness during her day, whether from receiving good news, spending time with friends, or accomplishing something meaningful, she would consciously think, "I feel happy," while she was actually feeling that happiness in her body. She wouldn't translate from the Spanish word for happiness. Instead, she would connect the English words directly to the physical sensations, mental state, and overall experience of being happy. At first, this practice felt awkward because Elena's natural instinct was to experience emotions in Spanish. But she persisted with the practice, understanding that she was training her brain to create new emotional pathways in English, rather than relying on Spanish emotional pathways with English translations attached. After 1 week of practicing happiness associations, Elena noticed something remarkable. When she thought the English phrase, "I feel happy," it began to trigger a slight echo of actual happiness, rather than just intellectual understanding of the concept. The English words were starting to connect directly to her emotional experience, rather than going through Spanish first. Elena then expanded her practice to other basic emotions. When she felt genuinely excited about weekend plans or upcoming events, she would think, "I feel excited," while experiencing that actual excitement. When she felt peaceful during quiet moments or nature walks, she would think, "I feel peaceful," while accessing that genuine sense of peace. When she felt grateful for good things in her life, she would connect those authentic grateful feelings directly to the English words, "I feel grateful." The most significant breakthrough came when Elena began practicing this technique with more complex and subtle emotions. Elena was naturally a very emotionally aware person who experienced nuanced feelings that didn't always have simple labels. She learned to connect English words to these complex emotional experiences as well. When Elena felt that particular kind of satisfaction that comes from helping someone solve a problem, she would think, "I feel fulfilled," while experiencing that specific emotion. When she felt the bittersweet combination of pride and sadness watching a friend succeed and move away, she would connect those complex feelings to English words like, "I feel proud and sad at the same time." After 2 months of consistent emotional association practice, Elena had a breakthrough experience that convinced her the technique was working. Elena was having a conversation with an international colleague about a challenging case study, and she found herself naturally expressing empathy and understanding in English that felt completely authentic and emotionally connected. She wasn't translating her empathy from Spanish to English. She was feeling and expressing genuine empathy directly in English. Elena realized that her English emotional vocabulary had become connected to real emotional experiences rather than just Spanish translations. When Elena said, "I feel concerned about this client" in English, she was expressing genuine concern that she was feeling in the moment, not a translated version of Spanish concern. The most profound change was that Elena's English conversations became emotionally engaging and meaningful in the same way her Spanish conversations had always been. Elena could build emotional rapport with English-speaking colleagues, express authentic care and understanding, and communicate the full depth of her thoughts and feelings without feeling like she was wearing an emotional mask. Elena told me that developing authentic emotional expression in English transformed not just her language abilities but her sense of identity and connection with English-speaking colleagues and friends. I need to talk to you about the mental obstacles that might be preventing you from developing natural English thinking, because understanding and overcoming these psychological barriers is often more important than learning the techniques themselves. Over the years, I've discovered that many students who struggle with English thinking aren't struggling because they lack ability or because the techniques don't work. They're struggling because their minds are creating internal resistance that sabotages their practice before they even begin. The first and most common mental obstacle is the fear of making mistakes in your thoughts. This might sound strange because nobody else can hear your thoughts, so how can you make mistakes that anyone will notice or judge? But many English learners have developed such a strong association between English and being evaluated or corrected that they bring this fear into their private thinking practice. They worry that if they think an incorrect English sentence in their mind, they're reinforcing bad habits or learning English wrong. This fear of mental mistakes creates a paralyzing perfectionism that prevents natural thinking flow. Instead of allowing thoughts to flow naturally and imperfectly, students get stuck trying to construct each English thought perfectly before allowing themselves to think it. They pause to check their mental grammar, worry about word choices, and edit their thoughts before they're even fully formed. This process makes English thinking feel laborious and artificial, which defeats the entire purpose of developing natural English thinking patterns. The solution to this obstacle is understanding that imperfect practice is infinitely better than no practice at all. Your private English thinking doesn't need to be grammatically perfect or sophisticated. In fact, simple, imperfect English thoughts practiced consistently will develop into natural, fluent thinking much faster than complex, carefully constructed thoughts practiced occasionally. Give yourself permission to think simple, imperfect, even awkward English thoughts without judgment or self-correction. The second major obstacle is what I call native language comfort zone addiction. Your brain has become so comfortable and efficient at thinking in your native language that switching to English thinking feels unnecessarily difficult and slow. Your brain resists English thinking practice because it can accomplish the same mental tasks much faster and easier in your native language. This creates internal resistance every time you try to practice English thinking. This comfort zone resistance often manifests as your mind wandering back to your native language without your conscious awareness. You'll start practicing English thinking, but within minutes you'll realize that your thoughts have unconsciously switched back to your native language. This isn't a failure of willpower or concentration. It's your brain's natural tendency to choose the most efficient available pathway. Overcoming comfort zone resistance requires understanding that this mental resistance is normal and temporary. Your brain isn't being stubborn or lazy. Your brain is trying to help you by using familiar, efficient thinking patterns. But you can train your brain to gradually become more comfortable with English thinking by making the practice feel safe, enjoyable, and rewarding rather than forced or stressful. The third common obstacle is comparison anxiety, where students constantly compare their English thinking ability to their native language thinking ability and feel discouraged by the difference. They expect their English thoughts to flow with the same speed, complexity, and emotional depth as their native language thoughts, and when this doesn't happen immediately, they conclude that they're not making progress, or that English thinking isn't possible for them. This comparison creates unrealistic expectations that guarantee frustration and disappointment. Expecting beginning English thinking to match advanced native language thinking is like expecting to run at the same speed on a mountain trail that you've never hiked before as you do on a familiar neighborhood route you've been running for years. The comparison isn't fair or useful, and it creates discouragement that undermines motivation and consistency. The solution is shifting your comparison focus from English thinking versus native language thinking to English thinking today versus English thinking last week or last month. Measure your progress against your previous English thinking ability rather than against your native language thinking ability. Celebrate improvements in English thinking duration, naturalness, spontaneity, and emotional authenticity without comparing these improvements to your native language capabilities. Another significant obstacle is what I call the translation addiction, where students become so dependent on mental translation that they resist techniques designed to bypass translation altogether. Translation feels safe and familiar because it uses existing language skills, while direct English thinking feels risky and uncertain because it requires developing entirely new mental pathways. Students with translation addiction often resist visual and emotional association techniques because these techniques feel too different from their established learning patterns. They prefer to keep translating from their native language because it feels like a more secure way to ensure accuracy and understanding. But this translation dependency prevents the development of natural English thinking because it reinforces the very mental patterns they're trying to change. Overcoming translation addiction requires gradually reducing reliance on translation while building confidence in direct English thinking abilities. Start by using direct English thinking techniques for very simple, concrete concepts that feel safe and manageable. As your confidence grows with basic direct thinking, gradually expand to more complex concepts and abstract ideas. The final major obstacle is inconsistency rationalization, where students create elaborate mental justifications for not practicing regularly. They tell themselves they're too busy, too tired, not in the right mood, or that they'll start practicing seriously next week when their schedule is less hectic. These rationalizations feel reasonable and logical, but they're actually forms of resistance that prevent progress. Inconsistency rationalization often stems from perfectionist thinking patterns, where students believe they need large blocks of uninterrupted time to practice effectively. When they can't find these perfect practice conditions, they choose not to practice at all, rather than practicing in less than ideal circumstances. This all-or-nothing approach leads to weeks or months without practice, which prevents the consistent repetition necessary for building new neural pathways. The solution is embracing imperfect practice conditions and minimal practice sessions. 5 minutes of English thinking practice during a busy, stressful day is more valuable than no practice at all. Practicing English thinking while you're tired, distracted, or pressed for time is better than waiting for perfect conditions that might never come. Consistency with imperfect conditions builds stronger habits than perfection with inconsistent conditions. Understanding these mental obstacles helps you recognize when they're affecting your practice and gives you specific strategies for working through them rather than being stopped by them. I want to tell you about Pierre from Lyon, whose story perfectly illustrates how the fear of making mental mistakes can completely paralyze English thinking development, and more importantly, how overcoming this fear can unlock natural English thinking abilities that seemed impossible before. Pierre was an engineer who worked for an international company that required him to use English daily in meetings, emails, and technical documentation. His written English was excellent, his comprehension was nearly perfect, and his speaking ability was more than adequate for professional communication. But Pierre had developed a psychological barrier that was preventing him from taking the next step toward natural English thinking. Pierre was terrified of making mistakes in his private English thoughts because he believed that thinking incorrectly in English would reinforce bad habits and make his English worse rather than better. This fear had become so strong that Pierre avoided internal English thinking practice altogether, even though he desperately wanted to develop the natural English thinking ability he saw in his bilingual colleagues. Pierre's fear wasn't irrational or unusual. He had spent years in formal English classes where mistakes were corrected immediately, where accuracy was emphasized above fluency, and where making errors was treated as something to be avoided rather than embraced as part of the learning process. Pierre had internalized the message that English mistakes were evidence of failure rather than stepping stones toward improvement. This perfectionist mindset worked reasonably well for Pierre's professional English use because his work environment gave him time to carefully construct emails, review technical documents, and prepare for presentations. Pierre could take his time to ensure accuracy and avoid mistakes in his professional English communication. But this same careful, error-avoiding approach was completely incompatible with developing natural, spontaneous English thinking. When Pierre tried to practice English thinking techniques, his fear of mental mistakes created a paralyzing self-consciousness. Instead of allowing English thoughts to flow naturally, Pierre would pause after every few words to check whether his mental sentence was grammatically correct. He would stop mid-thought to worry about whether he was using the right vocabulary or whether his English thoughts were reinforcing incorrect patterns. This constant mental self-editing made English thinking practice feel exhausting and artificial. Pierre would spend more mental energy monitoring and correcting his thoughts than actually thinking in English. After a few minutes of this hyper-vigilant English thinking practice, Pierre would feel mentally drained and discouraged, which reinforced his belief that English thinking might not be possible for him. Pierre's fear became particularly intense when it came to emotional or personal thoughts in English. He felt comfortable thinking about technical work concepts in English because these topics felt safe and factual. But when Pierre tried to think about his feelings, his personal experiences, or his opinions in English, the fear of thinking incorrectly became overwhelming. Pierre worried that expressing personal thoughts in imperfect English would somehow diminish or distort his authentic self. The breakthrough came when Pierre and I had a conversation about the difference between accuracy and fluency, and why prioritizing accuracy in private thinking practice actually prevents the development of natural fluency. I explained to Pierre that his brain needed permission to make mistakes in order to develop automatic English thinking patterns. Perfect English thoughts produced slowly and carefully would never become the natural, effortless English thinking he was hoping to develop. I asked Pierre to consider how he had learned to speak French as a child. Pierre certainly hadn't spoken perfect French from the beginning. He had made countless mistakes, used incorrect grammar, mixed up words, and expressed himself imperfectly for years before developing natural French fluency. But these mistakes hadn't damaged his French or prevented him from eventually becoming a fluent French speaker. Instead, these mistakes had been necessary steps in his French development process. Pierre began to understand that his private English thinking practice needed to follow the same imperfect, mistake-filled process that had naturally led to his French fluency. I encouraged Pierre to think of English thinking mistakes as evidence that his brain was actively working to develop new language pathways rather than evidence that he was learning English incorrectly. Pierre decided to experiment with this new mindset by giving himself explicit permission to think imperfect English thoughts during his practice sessions. Instead of trying to construct perfect English sentences in his mind, Pierre began allowing simple, grammatically imperfect, vocabulary-limited English thoughts to flow without self-correction or judgment. At first, this approach felt completely wrong to Pierre because it went against everything he had been taught about language learning. His English thoughts were simple, sometimes incorrect, and often awkward compared to his sophisticated French thoughts. But Pierre noticed that these imperfect English thoughts flowed much more naturally than his previous carefully constructed English thinking attempts. After 1 week of practicing imperfect English thinking, Pierre realized that he could maintain English thinking for longer periods, without mental fatigue because he wasn't spending energy on constant self-correction. After 2 weeks, Pierre noticed that some of his simple English thoughts were beginning to feel more natural and automatic, even though they weren't grammatically perfect. The most significant breakthrough came when Pierre began applying this imperfect thinking approach to personal and emotional topics. Instead of avoiding personal English thoughts because he couldn't express them perfectly, Pierre began thinking about his feelings, experiences, and opinions in simple, imperfect English. These personal English thoughts felt authentic and meaningful even when they weren't sophisticated or grammatically correct. After 1 month of consistent, imperfect English thinking practice, Pierre experienced something remarkable. He realized that many of his English thoughts were naturally becoming more correct and sophisticated, without any conscious effort to improve them. His brain was automatically refining his English thinking patterns through repetition and practice, but this natural improvement only happened when Pierre stopped trying to force perfection. Pierre told me that learning to embrace imperfect English thinking had transformed not only his language abilities but his entire relationship with learning and personal growth. He realized that his perfectionist tendencies had been preventing progress in many areas of his life, not just English learning. Within 3 months, Pierre was thinking naturally in English about complex personal and professional topics with the same ease and authenticity he had always experienced in French thinking. His English thoughts had become sophisticated and largely correct. But this improvement had happened through embracing imperfection rather than demanding perfection from the beginning. Now I want to share with you the most practical part of developing natural English thinking, which is creating sustainable daily habits that will actually stick in your real life, not just sound good in theory. I've worked with thousands of students over the years, and I've noticed that the people who successfully develop natural English thinking aren't necessarily the most talented or motivated students. They're the students who figure out how to make English thinking practice feel effortless and automatic, rather than like additional work they have to remember to do every day. The biggest mistake I see students make is trying to practice English thinking for too long when they're just starting out. They get excited about the techniques, decide to practice for 30 minutes or an hour each day, and then burn out within a week because this amount of practice feels overwhelming and unsustainable, alongside their normal daily responsibilities. These students often conclude that they don't have enough time or discipline for English thinking practice, when the real problem is that they started with unrealistic expectations about how much practice is necessary. The truth is that 5 minutes of consistent English thinking practice every single day will produce better results than 30 minutes of practice done inconsistently a few times per week. Your brain develops automatic patterns through repetition and consistency, not through intensive but irregular practice sessions. Building English thinking habits is like building physical fitness. You get stronger by exercising a little bit every day, rather than exercising intensively once or twice per week. Here's exactly how to start building sustainable English thinking habits. Choose one routine activity that you already do every single day without fail, something so automatic that you never forget to do it. This might be brushing your teeth, making your morning coffee, walking to work, or eating lunch. You're going to attach your English thinking practice to this existing automatic behavior so that English practice becomes just as automatic and inevitable. Let's say you choose your morning coffee routine as your habit anchor. Every single day, while your coffee is brewing or while you're drinking your first cup, you'll practice 5 minutes of mental narration in English. You'll think about your plans for the day, observe what's happening around you, or reflect on how you're feeling, all in simple English thoughts. The key is that this practice happens at exactly the same time every day, attached to an activity you already do automatically. Starting with just 5 minutes might feel too small to be meaningful, but this is exactly why it works. 5 minutes feels manageable and non-threatening, so you're more likely to actually do it consistently. 5 minutes is short enough that you won't feel overwhelmed or mentally fatigued, which means you'll associate English thinking practice with positive feelings rather than stress or exhaustion. And 5 minutes is long enough to give your brain real practice at creating and strengthening English thinking pathways. After 2 weeks of consistent 5-minute practice, you can gradually expand your practice time if you want to, but only if the 5-minute habit feels completely automatic and effortless. Maybe you expand to 7 minutes, then 10 minutes, always ensuring that the practice still feels sustainable and pleasant, rather than forced or stressful. The goal is building a habit that you can maintain for months and years, not creating an intensive practice routine that you'll abandon after a few weeks. You can also add additional English thinking practice opportunities throughout your day, but always attach them to existing routine activities rather than trying to remember to practice at random times. While you're walking somewhere, you can practice English narration of what you observe. While you're waiting in line or for an appointment, you can practice imaginary English conversations. While you're doing routine household tasks, you can practice English thought replacement. The key is making English thinking practice feel like a natural extension of activities you're already doing rather than additional tasks you need to remember and schedule. This approach removes the mental effort of remembering to practice and eliminates the scheduling challenges that often prevent consistent practice. One of the most effective strategies for sustainable habit building is what I call the minimum viable practice principle. This means committing to a practice routine that's so small and easy that you could do it even on your worst, busiest, most stressful days. Maybe that's just 2 minutes of English thinking while you brush your teeth, or 30 seconds of English narration while you walk from your car to your office. Having a minimum viable practice option prevents the all-or-nothing thinking that destroys habit consistency. Instead of skipping practice entirely when you don't have time for your full routine, you can always fall back on your minimum practice, which maintains your habit momentum and prevents the sense of failure that often leads to giving up entirely. Another crucial element of sustainable habits is tracking your consistency rather than tracking your performance quality. Instead of worrying about whether your English thinking was sophisticated or accurate during each practice session, simply track whether you practiced or not. You can mark an X on a calendar, use a habit tracking app, or just keep a simple list. The goal is building awareness of your consistency patterns and celebrating the achievement of showing up for practice, regardless of how the practice felt. Most people underestimate how much progress happens through small, consistent actions accumulated over time. 5 minutes of English thinking practice every day for 3 months equals 15 hours of practice, which is more than many people get in formal English classes. But because the practice is spread out and attached to routine activities, it doesn't feel like 15 hours of work. It feels like a natural part of daily life. You should also plan for obstacles and disruptions rather than hoping they won't happen. What will you do when you travel and your normal routine is disrupted? What's your backup plan when you're sick or dealing with a family emergency? Having predetermined strategies for maintaining some form of English thinking practice during challenging periods prevents temporary disruptions from becoming permanent habit breakdowns. The most sustainable English thinking habits are the ones that adapt to your life rather than requiring your life to adapt to them. If you're a morning person, build your primary practice into your morning routine. If you're naturally more reflective in the evenings, attach your practice to evening activities. If you have a long commute, use that travel time for English thinking practice. Work with your natural energy patterns and existing schedule rather than trying to force practice into times that don't suit your lifestyle. Remember that building sustainable habits is more important than perfect technique execution. It's better to practice simple English thinking consistently for months than to practice advanced techniques sporadically for a few weeks. We've covered so much ground together today, and I want you to take a moment to appreciate what you've just learned. You now have 4 powerful techniques that can completely transform your relationship with English thinking. You understand the science behind why your brain defaults to your native language and how to work with your brain's natural learning patterns rather than fighting against them. Most importantly, you've heard real stories from people just like you who have successfully made this transition from mental translation to natural English thinking. Let me remind you of the 4 techniques we've explored today. First, daily mental narration, where you practice thinking about simple routine activities in English, training your brain to choose English pathways for automatic thinking. Second, imaginary conversations, where you practice common scenarios in your mind, preparing your brain for real English interactions by creating familiar thought patterns. Third, gradual thought replacement, where you gently catch native language thoughts and replace them with English equivalents, slowly shifting your mental habits. And fourth, visual and emotional association, where you connect English words directly to your experiences and feelings rather than to translations from your native language. Each of these techniques works differently, and each person responds better to some techniques than others. You don't need to master all 4 techniques immediately. In fact, trying to implement everything at once is likely to overwhelm you and prevent consistent practice. Instead, I want you to choose just one technique that resonates most strongly with you right now, today, and commit to practicing that single technique for the next 2 weeks. If you're someone who enjoys routine and structure, daily mental narration might be perfect for you. Start tomorrow morning with 5 minutes of English thinking during your coffee routine or morning walk. If you're naturally social and enjoy conversation, imaginary conversations could be your breakthrough technique. Practice simple scenarios during your commute or while you're waiting for appointments. If you're detail-oriented and like gradual improvement, thought replacement might appeal to you. Begin noticing and gently replacing just a few automatic thoughts each day. If you're emotionally expressive and value authentic connection, visual and emotional association could transform your English experience. Start connecting English words to real feelings and experiences as they happen in your daily life. The most important thing to remember is that thinking in English is a skill, not a talent. Skills improve with practice, and practice requires patience, consistency, and self-compassion. You're not going to wake up tomorrow thinking naturally in English, and that's perfectly normal and expected. But if you practice consistently, even for just a few minutes each day, you will notice changes within the first few weeks. These changes might be subtle at first, but they represent real progress in your brain's ability to process thoughts directly in English. I want you to remember the stories you've heard today. Maria from Madrid, who went from frustration to natural English thinking in 30 days. Thomas from London, who discovered that even native English speakers face the same challenges when learning new languages. Sophie from Paris, who unlocked emotional authenticity in English through internal monologue practice. Marco from Rome, whose professional tours became more engaging when he developed automatic English responses. Anna from Berlin, who learned to maintain consistent English thinking through structured conversation practice. Carlos from Barcelona, who discovered the power of celebrating small victories and maintaining patient consistency. Elena from Madrid, who developed authentic emotional expression by connecting English words to real feelings. Pierre from Lyon, who overcame perfectionist paralysis by embracing imperfect practice. Each of these people started exactly where you are right now, feeling frustrated by the mental translation process and wondering if natural English thinking was possible for them. They all discovered that it was not only possible, but achievable through consistent application of the techniques you've learned today. Their success doesn't make them special or uniquely talented. It makes them examples of what's possible when you combine the right techniques with consistent practice and patient persistence. Your English thinking journey is just beginning, and I'm genuinely excited for you because I know what lies ahead. I know that within a few weeks of consistent practice, you'll catch yourself having your first spontaneous English thought, and you'll feel that spark of possibility that comes from realizing your brain is actually changing. I know that within a few months, you'll have moments of natural English thinking that feel as effortless and authentic as your native language thinking. And I know that eventually, you'll develop the bilingual thinking ability that will transform not just your English communication, but your entire relationship with the English language. I want to hear about your progress and your breakthroughs because your success stories inspire other learners who are just starting this journey. Please share your experiences in the comments below. Tell us which technique you're going to try first. Share your first spontaneous English thought when it happens, and let us know how these methods work for you. Your progress matters not just to you, but to this entire community of English learners who are supporting each other toward fluency. If this episode has been helpful for you, please show your support by subscribing to the English Talk community and sharing this content with other English learners who might benefit from these techniques. Every subscription and share helps us reach more people who are struggling with the same challenges you've been facing, and it helps us continue creating practical, effective content that makes real difference in people's English learning journeys. Remember that you have everything you need to succeed at developing natural English thinking. You have the techniques, you understand the science, you've heard the success stories, and most importantly, you have a brain that's capable of remarkable change and growth. Trust in your ability to develop this skill. Be patient with the process, and celebrate every small step forward along the way. Thank you for spending this time with me today, and I'll see you in the next episode of the English Talk community, where we'll continue exploring practical methods for achieving English fluency and confidence.